My name is John Permani. I'll be facilitating tonight's meeting. This is the former Ford Air Neutronics property meeting for the Sea Island Community Association. It's being hosted by the Santa Ana Regional Water Quality Control Board, and we're going to be discussing the results of your human health risk assessment for your community and the soil vapor extraction pilot test. We'll also talk about next steps, and there'll be time to answer your questions. So first, just some ground rules. The meeting is being recorded so that anyone who's not here tonight can watch it at a later date. We'll have time throughout the presentation to answer your questions, and then we'll also save time at the end. You guys can feel free to just unmute yourself and ask your questions. You can use the chat function, or if you want, you can use the raise your hand function in Zoom, and we can call on you that way. For questions that are related to your property, your home, maybe about indoor air sampling results, we ask that you put your name, number, and your address in the chat function, and we'll have a representative from the team follow up with you directly. And if you have any questions after this meeting, you can feel free to contact Jessica Law, the case manager. Her number and email are below, or you can contact Ford's project information line, and that number is on the slide as well. We've also put that information into the chat box for you guys. So as I mentioned tonight, the purpose of the meeting is to discuss the findings from the March 2021 Human Health Risk Assessment, as well as the SVE pilot test, discuss next steps, and answer your questions. There's a variety of handouts that we've got listed on the slide. Those you can actually find on Ford's website, and they provide a little bit more background information. For the project team tonight presenting, we have Jessica Law, who is the case manager with the Regional Water Quality Control Board. We have Amanda Palumbo, who is a toxicologist with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, who reviewed the health risk assessment. And then we have Ford's technical team, Wood Environment and Infrastructure. And from that team, we've got Mike Barnes, the project manager, and Jane Parkin-Coleman, who is the risk assessor. And she will be talking about the human health risk assessment shortly. This is our agenda for this evening. Like I've mentioned, we will be pausing between each speaker to answer your questions. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jane.
Great. Thank you, John, for the introduction, and good evening to the residents and representatives of Sea Island. I will be talking about the human health risk assessment for this area. The risk assessment is an important document, and Wood has a large team of scientists that are specifically trained to prepare risk assessments, and that is what we focus on. So as mentioned, my name is Jane Parkin-Coleman. I've been conducting risk assessments for about 15 years. You may have seen my colleagues, Karen or Usha, at other meetings, and they and I are part of the team that has prepared the risk assessments for the Ford Air Neutronics site. Just to introduce some context, a risk assessment is all about the chance of an event occurring. So this is about chances and doesn't represent certainty. Perception of these risks or chances is about choices and behavior, and those vary by individual. So when we conduct a risk assessment, it is to help people inform their choices. We do make some risk management recommendations in the risk assessment, but risk management is ultimately the water board's role and is part of what they do. So we can go to the first slide there. The four key components of a standard risk assessment have been presented at the community-wide meeting, but we know that many of you may not have been at that meeting, so we just wanted to introduce these concepts again. Wood has done all of these steps in the risk assessment, and that whole process is what we are reporting on tonight. The 4 steps are shown here. The first step is data collection and evaluation. This includes deciding which contaminants we are going to look for, and then determining where they are and how much of them is in the environment. Specifically for the risk assessment for this site, we have collected samples of indoor air and soil gas. It's important to note that the more data that we have to put into this process, the more confidence we have in the results. The data used in the risk assessment had been collected over about 2 years. The second step of the risk assessment is exposure assessment. And this answers the questions of who, what, when, where, and how much for the risk assessment. The process of evaluating exposure is designed on purpose by regulatory agencies to be protective of human health. So for example, one of the assumptions that we make about exposure is that a resident is present in their home for 24 hours a day, 350 days per year, and that they live in their property for 26 years. The next step is toxicity assessment, and this specifically refers to the numeric criteria that are used to evaluate how toxic a chemical is. There are toxicity criteria that are related to both cancer and non-cancer effects. So only some chemicals are considered to potentially cause cancer, and so only those have cancer toxicity values. All of this information put together, the chemical data, the exposure assessment, and the toxicity values, is used to do the risk calculations. That's where we estimate both hazard, which is the non-cancer component, and cancer risk for each specific residence. Next slide, please. Jessica also presented this slide on risk management at a community-wide meeting. And the main message of this slide is that we get a lot of numbers out of the risk assessment. And some of them are related to the chance of cancer. We call that cancer risk. And some of them are based on non-cancer hazard, which are the other health effects not related to cancer. So based on the ranges of these numbers, which are shown here in the left column, we put the results into decision boxes, and that is what is shown on the right column. So when a result is in the red range, agencies like the Water Board recommend that some action needs to occur to reduce these risks. When a result is in the yellow range, we need to determine what to do next. And this usually includes something like additional investigation or monitoring. When a result is in the green range, it means that the health risk is considered insignificant and no action needs to occur. So these risk ranges that are shown on this slide are equivalent to the risk ranges that have been identified by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And what the US EPA refers to as their risk management range is an estimated cancer risk between 1 × 10⁻⁶ and 1 × 10⁻⁴. And so that is where this yellow range comes from. I am going to use this color scheme throughout the presentation to represent these risk ranges. So you'll see this on a couple different slides. Next slide, please, John. This slide presents our approach to developing the human health risk assessment. Our process is consistent with the applicable guidance from the various agencies in California, and also with the technical approach memo that Wood wrote and was approved by the Water Board. As mentioned on the risk assessment slide, the approach was developed to be protective of human health. In the risk assessment, we have presented the results in several different ways. So this means that the risk assessment has a lot of numbers in it, and we understand that this may be confusing. So to help with that, I'm just going to briefly summarize each of the types of calculations that we did. As shown in the second bullet on this slide, first we did an evaluation of current risk, and the risks for current conditions are evaluated based specifically on indoor air measurements. So this provides information about what the conditions are at the present time in a particular residence. The main uncertainty with that evaluation is that we don't know how indoor air measurements might change over time in the future. So things that can change over time are, for example, a change in conditions in the subsurface. So the chemicals that are present in the subsurface might move around over time, or your building might change over time. And this could have some effect on the indoor air concentrations. We also assume that you live in your residence for a long time, and that was the 26-year period. So to account for all these uncertainties in the risk assessment, we present a range of future possibilities that try to account for potential changes. So we evaluated risks as they could exist in the future in 3 different ways, and that's what's shown in the last bullet. The future conditions risk is based on soil gas data from the subsurface, and these soil gas data are used to estimate possible future indoor air conditions. For future risk, we evaluated every property, whether we have collected indoor air samples at the property or not. And to do this, we use the data from the soil gas sampling locations that are located in the underground parking garages of each building that's within our investigation area. So the first approach for the future risk evaluation was a default screening approach, and this is based on US EPA's nationwide database, and it is the most stringent approach. The next approach is a multi-parcel wide approach, and this is based on soil gas data collected in your neighborhood and other parts of the site. So we use this approach to recommend the next steps for your neighborhood because we think it is the most appropriate and still health protective for decision making. The reasons that we think this is because this approach is based specifically on data collected in your neighborhood, and that data set is larger than the relevant data set in EPA's database. The nationwide database that was created by the US EPA really only has data from 4 homes that have a similar slab on grade foundation construction that are like those in your neighborhood. California agencies are currently compiling data from this investigation at the Ford site and other vapor intrusion investigations in California to come up with a more applicable California-specific approach for this type of evaluation. The last way that we presented the results for potential future risks was using a building-specific evaluation, and that was based on data from your particular building instead of the whole neighborhood. So the primary assumption here is that vapor intrusion conditions won't change significantly over time for your building. And the next slide, please, John. Thank you. This slide summarizes the risks that we calculated for your neighborhood. And we know that talking about cancer itself is scary, but when we're talking about cancer risk, we're talking about the chance of getting cancer. So the point of this slide is to illustrate how the chance of other events occurring, like say getting struck by lightning or the rolling of a dice, compares to the risk results for the Sea Island neighborhood. The colors here are the same as for the cancer risk decision boxes that were on the earlier slide. So in the United States, we have about a 1 in 3 chance of getting some form of cancer over our lifetime. So that risk would be at the top of this chart in the red, higher than the chance of rolling a 1 on a die. So for the current conditions at Sea Island, using the indoor air data, we were able to evaluate 7 properties, and no homes fell into the red or the yellow for cancer risk. So all 7 properties that we evaluated are in the green risk range, and the risks that were calculated are represented by that dot for current risk. The future risk range is shown with the arrows on the right, and this one goes from the lower end of the red range through the yellow and into the green range. So as I described on the previous slide, since we can't predict the future, we evaluated a couple of different scenarios for each property, and so that gives us a wider range of future risks. So when we have results in the red or yellow, we can do something about that, and that is going to be the focus of Jessica's presentation. The goal of the next steps after the risk assessment is to move properties from the red and yellow into the green zone. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of the current conditions results. And so there are 34 homes in the investigation area for Sea Island. And at the time that we did the risk assessment, 11 of them had some indoor air data that had been collected. And then 7 of those had at least 2 sets of indoor air, seasonal indoor air data, which is what we needed to conduct the current risk assessment. And of course, the take-home message here is that all of the properties that we evaluated for current conditions are in the green risk range. And we can go to the last slide. Thank you. Lastly, this is a summary of the future conditions risk evaluation. And the figure shown on this slide is figure 8 from the risk assessment report. The only thing we added is the yellow circle there, which gives you an additional perspective, as that yellow circle corresponds to the yellow color of the risk ranges that we talked about earlier. So this figure also represents the recommendations that we made based on the risk assessment. And just to give you a little bit of perspective, on the figure, you can see the outlines of each property, and we labeled them with a numerical ID. And we used numbers instead of addresses to maintain the privacy of residents. And so of the 34 properties that we evaluated, 26 are shown in green, and that's the insignificant risk level for future risk. And 8, which are the ones shaded in blue, are in the yellow risk management range. So a couple things just to point out relative to this evaluation is that these are future risk estimates based on soil gas measurements and not the indoor air that you're breathing right now. These predictions are not set in stone. They're potential future scenarios that we developed and used to make recommendations. And as I said, the green shading, which applies to most of the properties, indicates that the risks are considered to be insignificant and acceptable for future conditions. And in the case where we have the blue properties with the yellow circle, that is because the cancer risk is between or is within that cancer risk management range of 1 × 10⁻⁶ to 1 × 10⁻⁴. But the non-cancer hazard is still below 1. The Water Board is going to use these results for the future risk evaluation to make long-term decisions for how to manage the site in a health protective way. These decisions are going to be made on a building specific basis. So that is for each group of properties that are within a particular building. And since the Water Board is using the results of the wood risk assessment to inform their decisions, they've also had OHHA independently review the risk results to provide their opinion. And so that's what Amanda is going to discuss next. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say thank you very much for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, Jim, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, I was just wondering that the map with the green and blue squares represent not our whole community here.
Correct.
And that we have buildings to the left, to the far left of the green, and to the far right of the green. Is there a reason why those buildings were excluded?
Yes, there is.
I can go ahead and answer that one.
Yeah.
They fall outside of the indoor air investigation area, and that's why there are soil gas monitoring points in those areas that have either, I want to say, I don't have the map in front, so Mike,
well,
you
Jessica,
may remember, they're non-detect.
Jessica, the isocons are on this figure here a little bit.
Right, and so
Okay.
I guess I'm more referring, like, yeah, outside of that area where you don't see, there's and those isocons don't show the soil vapor probes. So there's these monitoring points outside that we know the concentrations are low enough that there isn't a concern for vapor intrusion. So that's why they were excluded.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions from folks?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, so this is Bruce Mosk, and I had two questions.
Mhm.
The first is, in the event that we were to sell a property in this development, have you developed a standard form disclosure to give to the new buyer as to what's going on in here?
Yep. So, I mean, I can answer that, Mike, if you don't, if that's.
I'll answer
Okay,
that one.
you
If that's
go
all
for
right.
it.
Yeah. So,
Sure.
so as far as disclosure of a property, if you're within the investigation area and you are having your property sampled, our recommendation is to use the results letter that you're provided that shows basically all of the results from the indoor testing of your particular property, and next steps. Use that document that is a Ford document as your disclosure.
And so the follow-up to that question is, what if you're not in that area, but you're a unit owner in Sea Island? Do we need to disclose anything to a future buyer?
So that is not a question that we're qualified to answer because we're not real estate attorneys or real estate agents. So I would discuss that with, if you're looking to sell, you would discuss that with your realtor.
I am a realtor, and I'm trying to obtain specific answers to that question, so we know how to protect both the seller and
Sure.
inform the current buyer. And I haven't seen any disclosure, any specific disclosure for this development.
Yeah, no, I would.
Go ahead. Wasn't there a small like 2-sentence thing that just kind of, that was intended to be used? I thought Ford developed that. Oh,
It was maybe provided in one of the presentations, but it wasn't, it was more of a
Okay.
statement rather than something to use as a
Okay.
disclosure.
So my third and final question is, would you prepare a statement that's very short but informative for a prospective buyer?
I would be happy to take that question back to Ford, but I can't answer that without talking to my client. But I can probably tell you that their kind of going statement is use the analytical results letter that you receive as part of the indoor air testing if you're within the investigation as a disclosure statement. And outside of that, we're not really providing any guidance on that. And we recommend people talk to a real estate attorney or real estate agent.
and I'll look at
But
what
I'd be
that,
happy to take the question back for you.
and I'll look at the past meetings that we've had for that disclosure statement. I feel like there was something specific that had been addressed for that question. So I'll find it. I'll see if I can find it. And then I know I have your email address, so I can email that to you.
Thank you, Jessica. I
And-
really appreciate it. That's it.
And then I see, yeah, and I see Gloria has her hand up, but I just wanted to also follow up. Part of the thing that I've done in the past is I've talked to plenty of real estate agents that are in either representing prospective buyers or sellers. And I've talked to sellers and buyers to kind of walk them through the process. Now, that's not necessarily an official disclosure of any sort, but they do call the response line. We do return their calls and try to answer as many of the questions that they may have. So
I just found it. It's really
Oh, thank
small.
you.
Here, this is what I have. I put the PDF of it in chat.
Oh,
And that's what it was to go along with for the indoor air sampling result. So as far as if your home hasn't been sampled, yeah. Well, I will also bring that up with Ford and request that they provide something in addition to the attached sampling letter.
thank you very much, Jessica.
Yeah, we'll see what
My
we
only
can do.
request is, could you please also email it to me? I can't seem to
Absolutely.
locate it in chats. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to take your time.
no
worries.
problem.
No worries.
And then I think Gloria has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.
Thank you. So just to, to review what you just said, if you're, let's say, in the blue category, but you haven't had your unit sampled, what I'm hearing you say is if you didn't get a letter that says these are your findings, you don't have any obligation to disclose anything.
So you're asking about how we would communicate the results of the risk, there's
To
different,
follow up with what Bruce was saying.
Yeah,
if you're selling a
I'll take that
property
one.
sure,
And you're in
Mike.
the blue, it just seems like something you're like,
As far as the obligation to disclose, it's not appropriate for Ford Motor Company to comment on that because we are not real estate attorneys or real estate agents or realtors. So when you disclose something in the sale of a property, that is something, disclosures are handled by either real estate attorneys or real estate agents. The letter that Jessica provided is what Ford is providing as far as a disclosure statement.
I can add to that as a geologist, not a real estate attorney or realtor. So I'm giving that disclaimer on it. If you have a home that is in that blue area and you would have been offered indoor air testing. And if you didn't have your home tested, you were still offered that letter. And that letter to have the home tested, my understanding, again, geologist, is that that should be included in the disclosure.
Okay.
That's my understanding. Again, I am no professional in that regard, but that's
But
where
that
you'd want to confirm.
clarifies that even if you weren't tested,
Yeah.
that and you didn't get the results, then you still have something that you could disclose. Thank you.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, every property that's shown, all the 34 properties that are shown on here have been offered indoor air testing. And if properties, change hands, then we re-offer testing to the new owners if they haven't been tested before, or if we need to continue sampling, then we would get an agreement with the new owners to continue sampling.
And if you have trouble locating that letter and need another copy of it, we'd be happy to mail one out to you if you want that. I think Sarah has put the 833 number in the chat line there. So just reach out to us. We'll put you in the contact with the appropriate person and get that in the mail to you.
Great, thanks, Mike. Are there any other questions? All right, I think we can go ahead and turn it over to you, Amanda.
Sure. So I work for the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, which we refer to as OHHA, which is a state agency. And my organization routinely reviews risk assessments on sites like these for the water boards. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the purpose of the OHHA review and then my results for your neighborhood. So it looks like I'm sharing my screen. So the purpose of the OHHA review is to check whether the risk assessment is reliable for the project manager, who is Jessica in this case, to use to make decisions about the site. So part of this is ensuring that the assessment is adequately health protective. During the review, I usually check the calculations and the resulting values, and I explain any differences I find. I also check that the sampling data are representative of exposure conditions and point out uncertainties. For example, if not enough samples were taken. So OHHA generally does not determine if or how the risk should be addressed. The purpose of my review is just about making sure the risks are described accurately. Okay. So for my assessment of the Sea Island community, in general, I found that wood followed appropriate guidance and calculations were correct. There were some differences. I will mention two of them. So one difference had to do with the fact that the laboratory methods could not detect low concentrations of one of the chemicals called vinyl chloride. In this case, OHHA assumes a low concentration of that chemical is there for the risk calculations. So in this case, it affected the risk estimates of current risk. And in your neighborhood, that resulted in 2 homes that were in the green being bumped up into the bottom of the yellow in my calculations for the current risk. But so overall, risks were still low. No homes were in the red. The second difference is in the way OHHA recommends evaluating future risk. So the health risk might be different in the future if, for example, someone remodels their home or their foundation cracks, and as a result, more contaminants are able to move into the home, which in turn can increase the health risk. So the future scenario is challenging to evaluate because we don't know how events in the future can affect risk. Wood included 3 different calculations to estimate future risk, which is helpful to see the different approaches. However, OHHA recommended the more protective approach, which follows U.S. Environmental Protection Agency guidance. OHHA's preferred approach resulted in risk estimates that were 60 times higher than Wood's 2 other approaches. Again, this is for the hypothetical future risk estimates, not what was measured inside your homes recently. I recommended the most protective of the 3 approaches in order to account for things that can increase risk in the future. This recommendation is also typical of OHHA reviews. We often identify uncertainties we feel are significant and recommend a more protective option. So that's all that I have. And I was turn it over to Jessica unless there's any questions for me.
Okay. If there's any questions, feel free to interrupt me if you think of something you want to ask Amanda, let me know, or we'll have some time at the end for Q&A as well. So just want to start off that before I start talking about our response, just want to cover the area that the risk assessment covers. Those homes are identified on the figure below. And as I mentioned a little earlier, there's soil gas monitoring points not shown on this figure that are used to determine this. And those points continue to be monitored regularly. So if your home falls in the indoor air investigation area, which is shaded green here, and has been offered indoor air testing, please have your home tested. And then lastly, the risk assessment will be updated in the future as more data is collected. So for the water board response, we evaluated the results from the risk assessment that Wood prepared and the comments and results from OHHA's review. And based on that, we considered the current risk and hazard results, as well as the future risk and hazard results for the next steps. So first, just want to talk about current risk and hazard, which identified vapor intrusion may be occurring at the one property. I'll also discuss the current ranges identified on the next slide. The second conclusion is acknowledging the unknown future conditions, such as building modifications and or the degradation of a building foundation that may increase vapor intrusion in the future. So as a result, future risk and hazard is calculated and considered in the next steps. And I'll talk more on that in the coming slides as well. So I want to talk about the results, what the ranges that were calculated mean, and how it informs our next steps. So first, I want to talk about those current risk and hazard ranges, which is calculated from results of the indoor air sampling. And just as a reminder, when I talk about risk, I'm referring to cancer risk, and when I talk about hazard, referring to the non-cancer health effects. Also, these calculations assume you are in your home 24 hours a day, 350 days a year over a 26-year period. So the current risk and hazard ranges fall between that green and barely into that yellow, which means homes that don't have any exceedances, they're in the green and there's no immediate response action needed. For homes that fall into that yellow area, they were just barely bumped into it. They are continuing to be monitored, and then that information also lets us know that we do need to do longer term monitoring. Some more assessment may be necessary, and then we can also consider if remediation or mitigation may be necessary. And that is where the future risk and hazard calculations help us in determining the next steps. So for future risk and hazard, these ranges are calculated based on soil gas concentration. So what is detected below the ground surface? At the beginning of the presentation, Wood mentioned that they calculated the future risk scenario 3 different ways. Of the 3 different ways, the most protective scenario they calculated is the way that OHHA calculates risk. Also, I want to mention that these future risk and hazard calculations are not guaranteed. It's an unknown right now if there will be any change from those current risk calculations. And that's why we do want to conduct some longer term monitoring and also consider these future risk and hazard calculations in our next steps. So the ranges I'm going to discuss are from OHHA's calculation based on soil gas collected from within the parking garages at 5 and 15 feet below the ground surface. And again, these calculations assume you are in your home 24 hours a day, 350 days a year over a 26-year period. So future risk and hazard using the most protective scenario ranged from green up to red. Therefore, we take the results from this calculation and compare it to the current risk and hazard calculations to assist in determining the next steps. But there's another layer we're considering as well. So at the beginning, oh, go this way, okay. So again, wood has those couple of different risk calculation scenarios, and OHHA therefore calculated risk from nearby soil gas probes in the streets within Sea Island using the most protective scenario, and one based on site-specific calculations. And this is important to compare the different calculated future risk and hazard calculations to assist us in our risk management decisions. So future risk and hazard using that most protective scenario with the probes that are located a little further away from the buildings ranged again from green to red. And then the future risk and hazard using the site-specific attenuation factor ranged from green and bumped just slightly into the red due to the hazard or non-cancer health effect number being right at 4. So that just bumped it right into the red. So the Water Board evaluates current risk and hazard calculations as well as those future calculations from data from both beneath the buildings to determine the immediate next steps, and then takes into consideration these future calculations based on the probes from out in the street, because based on what that soil gas plume is doing, meaning is it moving, is it getting bigger, is it getting smaller, this information helps us to determine the longer term next steps. So potential response actions in this case could be monitoring, additional assessment, or mitigation. And we also take in those higher estimations. Oh, sorry, I went to the wrong slide. We take into account those higher estimations when we look at either cancer risk or hazard. And another example of what we can do with this. So for homes with future risk that falls into the yellow area and they have that current risk in the green, monitoring is going to be the most appropriate path forward. For homes with a future risk and hazard that's in the red and the current risks are in the green to yellow, we're going to look at what that soil gas plume is doing. If concentrations are increasing, long-term mitigation or remediation along with monitoring may be an appropriate path forward. But if the soil gas plume and the concentrations are decreasing, then monitoring would be an appropriate path forward. And just the point that I want to make is that the Water Board takes into consideration both current and future risk and hazard calculations, all the different ways that that future risk was calculated to support the risk management decisions, which are the next steps. So from that risk assessment report, we identified the need to develop a feasibility study to evaluate the feasibility for potential remedial action of soil gas based on the current data, as well as the need to conduct some of that longer term indoor air monitoring. So as a result, the next steps included the submittal of 2 reports, a feasibility study, which was submitted on November 19th, and an indoor air monitoring plan, which was submitted on October 14th. So first, I want to talk about the feasibility study, and I do want to point out that this is to evaluate soil gas remediation only. Groundwater is still being assessed, so the need for any kind of groundwater remediation is going to be determined and evaluated at a later date. So the feasibility study is a comprehensive report that will include 3 main items. This first one is it proposes remedial action objectives, which are the goals of the remediation efforts or the cleanup efforts. The remedial action objectives need to be protective of public health, and they also need to be technically feasible to implement. The second component is the feasibility study itself. And this portion of the report looks at all of the remedial options and evaluates the feasibility of implementing to achieve those remedial action objectives. And the main components of the feasibility study take into consideration the ability to implement the technology, the effectiveness of the technology, and cost. And other factors also include acceptance by the regulatory agency, as well as acceptance by the public. And then the third component for this report will be to develop potential remedial alternatives. And based on the feasibility study and remedial action objectives, to recommend 1. Then there's the indoor air monitoring plan. So this is a longer term plan to evaluate indoor air to verify if vapor intrusion changes over time. And this is where we would take into consideration that parcel wide attenuation factor calculation that would develop that site specific data. A lot of data has been collected within this community as well as surrounding communities, and this is a great way to utilize it. So this longer term monitoring plan will provide analytical data to support whether the current risk and hazard calculations are still appropriate or not. The monitoring frequency will be based on soil gas concentrations and trends. And the frequency of sampling can range from every 6 months to once every 5 years. And Ford will be sending out letters at a later date to notify you of which sampling frequency category you fall into. So that's what I have for the soil, for the risk assessment portion. And before I start talking about the soil vapor extraction pilot test, just wanted to see if there were any questions on that. And if we're not seeing any, I'll just hop into this SVE pilot test part. And if you think of something, we'll have some time at the end. Okay, so we'll talk about the pilot test that was recently conducted. It was done at 3 locations: Bonita Creek area, which was in the Caltrans right away by the bike paths along that creek, located just next to the Newport North apartment homes. There was another pilot test conducted at the Bay Ridge Park community, and then the Sea Island community, or your community. And we are going to discuss the one that occurred within Sea Island. And that data from the pilot test location is what is being used in the feasibility study. So before I talk about the pilot test results, just want to provide a refresher about soil vapor extraction, which is also referred to as SVE. And this is a remedial technology that can remove vapors from soil above groundwater. And that area is referred to as the vadose zone. So contamination within the vadose zone is removed in the form of vapors through extraction wells, and the vapors are treated above ground, and those cleaned vapors are then released to the atmosphere. So just as another refresher, this inlay just shows how the soil particles kind of lay and how vapors can reside in between those spaces of the soil. And that is what is removed with those extraction wells. So the pilot tests, again, they were conducted at those 3 locations, the nearest one being within your community. And that pilot test consisted of 1 extraction well, and it ran for a total of 5 days. And during that time, there was 2 main things that were evaluated or monitored. First was vacuum pressure to see if and how much effect the extraction well is having. And second, soil vapor data was collected from the extraction well and nearby soil gas probes before and after the pilot test. And that data that was collected was used to evaluate 2 things. First, the radius of influence, which an example is shown by that green elliptical. And this just lets us know how far the vacuum from the extraction well reaches, both laterally and vertically. And the second item is how much contamination is being removed. So for the first part, I want to talk about radius of influence. Again, that's how far the vacuum effect on the extraction well reaches. So industry standard of a typical site would consider soil vapor extraction satisfactory with a radius of influence of 20 to 50 feet. Within your community, the radius of influence was 64 feet. So based on that metric, the results indicate a good radius of influence for the area. The next component was the total mass removed. And again, that's how much contamination is removed from below the ground. Industry standards for a typical site suggest that mass removal of 1 pound per day or greater at the startup of soil vapor extraction is satisfactory. During the pilot test, a total of 0.03 pounds was removed during that time, and it ended up operating a total of 52 hours. It was about 8 to 10 hours a day. And those results and the mass removed is consistent with the low VOC concentrations that have been detected below the ground in this area. So the results of the pilot test are used in the feasibility study when evaluating the best remedial approach for the site. And as I mentioned a few slides ago, the feasibility study takes into consideration the ability to implement the technology, the effectiveness of the technology, as well as cost, and then also acceptance by the regulatory agency and acceptance by the public. So for those of you that were at the public meeting a couple years ago in November 2019, you may remember my analogy of the effectiveness of soil vapor extraction based on soil type, and I compared it to a milkshake versus a slushie. So the milkshake represents tighter, finer grained soil like clay, which makes air movement more difficult and limited. And the slushie represents a soil type that is more permeable, where airflow is easier like sand. The radius of influence results indicate slushy. So the type of soil below the ground is favorable based on that particular metric. But the mass removal results indicates kind of almost finished slushy. You suck on the straw, but you don't get much from it. So in that regard, soil vapor extraction may not be as favorable. And these considerations, along with results from the risk assessment, are important in the feasibility study when determining the remedial approach for the site. So to summarize, the risk assessment results do support the risk management decisions. The feasibility study was submitted to the Water Board on November 19th. The pilot test results are used in that remedy evaluation. Our response is pending for that feasibility study. And once our review is complete, we are going to host a meeting with your community to discuss the feasibility study and the recommendations. So for more information, you can always go to GeoTracker, which is the state's database. This is where you can find all of the technical reports, analytical data, public outreach information, things like that. LIRIS List is the Water Board's email notification subscription, and we'll send out emails notifying you when the next general public meeting is. That is going to be on February 3rd. We're going to provide just a general update. There's also a site-specific webpage on the Water Board website. Then Ford has their site-specific website, an 800 number that has been added to the chat box as well. And then there's a local information repository at the local library there in Newport. So that concludes the presentation part, and we have time for any questions that you may have.
This is Phil. When did Ford close the plant?
1993.
Geez, I hope they made a lot of money.
And they had done a lot of, so they closed in 93, and from 93 till about, I think it was 96 or 97, they did a lot of cleanup activities, and that's when they got their soil closure from the local oversight program that allowed the property to be rezoned from industrial to residential. And that's when the case was transferred to us. And then we continued with oversight on groundwater assessment and remediation.
So out of curiosity, is there generally a bigger issue as you go downhill away from the Ford site, like where we're at? I mean, what about the people living in One Ford Road on top of the site, out of curiosity?
So there is some of the soil gas plume up there, but as I mentioned, they had done some pretty extensive remediation back in the early 90s, and based on the soil gas results, it does look like it was fairly effective. They still have some soil gas and VI issues up there as well, but we're seeing the extent of just what's migrated offsite.
And how far down towards the canyon does the research go?
So
Like you're
Correct.
doing research on the other side of Jamboree and into the actual canyon and wetlands down there?
So there are groundwater monitoring points down the kind of creek area, and then there's soil gas probes all around. And one of the things that that we are doing with the soil gas plume is it's being delineated to below laboratory detection levels, so to non-detect. So that way we know exactly how far it is migrated.
Is there a half-life to the plume, so to speak, that not that you're aware?
No, it doesn't. So what we are seeing is, I can't give a like specific half-life, but in most areas we are seeing decreasing trends at the kind of boundaries of the plume. And I know in just a couple spots have we seen soil gas show like more of an increasing trend, and that's really limited. But for the most part at the plume boundaries, they're decreasing, which is good information.
So years ago, when I first became aware of this and did some work with you, when I say work, I was just notified and tried to share with our association. They came in like down by the tennis court area, was one of the areas I recall, with like some kind of a big drill truck and that kind of thing. Was that like the soil vapor or the soil vapor extraction kind of thing that you're doing? Is that a temporary deal that you set up equipment and do that and then remove the equipment after you've made the extraction? Or would that have been something else that was going on at that time?
So I missed the date, and maybe Mike heard it.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think it was more location. The tennis court area, that most
Yes.
likely would have been a soil gas probe installation.
I got it. Okay. All right.
Yeah, and then the soil vapor extraction was closer to the entrance there on Ford Road.
Okay. All right. Terrific. Thanks.
This figure here just shows that yellow square is where that soil vapor extraction temporarily was in those parking spaces.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Great. I see Nadine and Bruce, you have your hand raised.
Oh, thank you. So other than being located in or around the Ford Aero Neutronics site, was there any particular event that caused all of this testing, like were there cancer swarms found someplace, or what was the reason that all this testing occurred? Or was it just the mere fact that it was near the Ford Aeronautics site?
So the reason, what started it was back in 2017, the Water Board requested Ford prepare a conceptual site model. And that just looks at all of the historical data and compared it to the current standards. And one of the things that it identified was back in 2006, 2008, and 2012, there were some limited soil gas assessments. And the conclusions at the time was there was no vapor intrusion concern based on just industry standards and industry knowledge at the time. Well, when that conceptual site model was done, we've learned more over, that 10-year period. And so that is what warranted the need to start looking. And so soil vapor probes were strategically placed based on that old soil gas data as well as groundwater concentrations. So what started it near your area was going in the golf course where the groundwater plume leaves the one Ford Road area and travels south, and it migrates through a buried arroyo through that golf course. And so they placed probes in there, and then based on those results did some step outs, and those step outs is what identified that soil gas plume within Sea Island and Belcourt Hill. Oh, Phil, you're muted if you were saying something. And I don't know if that answered your question completely.
Yes. Yeah,
okay.
For me, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It did.
Okay, good.
Any other questions?
If anyone's asking questions, you may be on mute.
You can also feel free to type in your questions on chat if you don't want to speak aloud. Okay, well, I will say that if you do have questions that you think of later, you're always welcome to contact Jessica. Her phone number is in the chat, or you can use the Ford hotline number, which is also in the chat. If there aren't any other questions, we can go ahead and conclude tonight's meeting. And thank you all for your time, taking some time out of your evening. And we appreciate you being here and hope you have a wonderful night.
Thank you,
Thank
Jeff.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you for a thorough and terrific report.
Thank you, Phil.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, good night,
Thank you
everyone.
all.
Good night, everyone.
Right.
Bye-bye.